Today, we'd like to get into the nitty gritty of reimbursement accounts and chat about how a plan year functions.
Welcome, listeners. We are so happy to have Jerame back on the podcast. Jerame has more than 14 years of combined FSA and HRA administration, medical benefits, and banking knowledge, coupled with 24 years of operations and process management. In 2016, he was named Nova's Steward of the Year, which is a premier award that recognizes a single associate living Nova's brand promise, shows outstanding dedication, and exemplifies Nova's commitment to stewardship. Jerame dedicates a portion of his free time volunteering to help those entering the job market by participating in a program called Workforce Readiness. We are thankful he's spending a little time with us today.
Hi there.
Jerame, you're back.
I'm back. This is like the only time I ever get invited back for anything.
So there are a lot of terms, conditions, and rules around these products. We refer to things as rollover, runout, and grace period. Mm-hmm. These terms typically cause a lot of confusion, so we want to clear things up a bit, and we're hoping you can talk to us today about what each of these mean and what members need to know so we can help users better understand the terminology. So yeah, rollover, runout, and grace period. I'm sure you have plenty to share on those three things.
Yeah, I do. So here, I'll tell you a story. So I thought about this when this comes up every year, and I actually incorporate something like this into interviews. So when I do interviews, I had interviewed with somebody, meaning that somebody was helping me interview another candidate. And one of the questions that person asked was, is there a question that we forgot to ask you? And I love it because it's really, when you think about it, it's pretty brilliant. So if I was to prepare to go for an interview as sort of the interviewee, the way that I would prepare is I'd probably do Google searches and say, what are the questions that are most likely going to be asked? So I would probably look up something like, they're going to ask me how to sell a pen. And so I'm going to come up with 55 reasons on how I'm going to sell a pen. And then I could go to the interview and they get done asking all these questions, but I had all this knowledge in the back of my head that they wish they would have just asked. And if someone would say, hey, what question didn't I ask? I would say, well, you didn't ask me how I would sell this pen. So I would give that. So what I'm saying here is I really wish HR, if given the opportunity, would ask me this question, and it would have to do with like the rollovers, the runouts, and the grace periods. So when I think about it, and it can get complex, but I think this podcast, or at least this discussion, would be able to help both the employer and the employee. And I'm going to try to break it down as simple as I can. And what I'll do is I'll start with a grace period. So the grace period actually only applies to a flexible spending account. Some people call it a flexible spending arrangement, but flexible spending account, FSA. So from a medical flex, what a grace period allows you to do is it allows you to spend last year's money, so to speak, in this year, but only up to a maximum of 75 days. And that is actually determined by the employer. The 75 days is the IRS maximum, but the employer can say 60 days or 15 days or whatever that is. But that does allow you to spend last year's FSA money. So in this case, if we're looking at 2021 to 2022, in 2022, you have from January 1st to March 15th of 2022 to use money from 2021 in your FSA.
If your employer picks the 75 days.
That is correct. If he picks the 75 days. And in some cases, depending on your employer, or if you are the employer, the debit card sometimes will look back to the grace period money first if that's programmed. It's one of the only times that a debit card will say is quote unquote smart enough. And systematically, that's because they overlap. So they have the ability to do that, but you do have to verify that either one is an employee to talk to your employer, who can then obviously talk to the administrator, or if the employer may have chosen that as a function. So just to give you kind of an easier version is just to know you're given a little bit of quote unquote grace into your new plan year to be able to use last year's FSA money.
So with grace period, you have to know how long you have, what that window of time is on your plan into the new plan year, that it's reflective. And you need to understand if your plan is set up so that if you swipe your card someplace, or you use your card to pay for something, it's smart enough to know to pull from last year's funds?
You are dead on. That is
Okay.
absolutely correct. In the event you have a debit card and it doesn't do that, and that's okay. Not every administrator is going to be able to do that. You still have the ability to send in a manual claim for those prior dates of service, and we'll talk about the time frame for that in just a couple of moments. But you do have that ability to submit, most likely through an app or online, or even if it comes down to mail or fax, you'll have that option as well. The next thing that we were going to talk about, and I'll tie some of this back together, is what they call a rollover, or you might even hear it be called a carryover of sorts.
Can I ask one more question quick about FSA, flexible spending accounts?
Yeah,
Does
for sure.
does that rule about grace period and FSA apply to just medical FSAs, or does that include any kind of FSA, like a dependent care account or a transportation account, or?
Right. That's a good question. The reality is it really should stick to medical flexible spending account. There are some employers that will try to implement a dependent care account. There's the nature of a dependent care account is like a pay to balance account, and typically is not something that they use in a grace period type situation. It is not that it's illegal. It's not illegal. It's just not heavily practiced typically. Parking and transit's a different section of the IRS, and the nature of that is a little different as well. That is the way that parking and transit works is actually it continues to roll from month to month. It's actually a month to month benefit. So a grace period is sort of a moot point when it comes to those benefits. And there are a couple other IRS code section 125 benefits that really wouldn't fall in line with those. I'm focusing more so on the FSA since it's the most heavily utilized.
Medical FSA.
Medical FSA.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Sorry. Continue.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, no problem. So from a rollover and carryover perspective, they're ultimately the same thing when you hear it, depending on who's talking about it. They can apply to both an FSA and an HRA. And it does mean pretty much what it sounds like. There is money that is ultimately left over that gets moved over into your new plan year. It's a little bit different for each, and let me explain it this way. So an FSA rollover, carryover, there's typically a maximum, and that does change ultimately every single year. And it's also dictated by the employer as far as what the cap is for that total amount. Most employers are going to go with the maximum amount just as an FYI. So that's normal as it relates to that carryover from one year to the next. From a health reimbursement arrangement or HRA, that's also one that the employer can dictate what that looks like, but there's really no IRS cap, at least at this point. So if they have a big, huge HRA that tends to accumulate for whatever purpose, they can roll it over whatever amount they dictate from year to year, and then you can use that money. The interesting caveat is a FSA rollover cannot exist in the same space as a grace period. So it's usually one or the other as it relates to an FSA. So you wouldn't have a grace period where you have a certain amount of time, up to 75 days, to use last year's money and then roll that over into the next year. It's usually one or the other. HRAs tends to be pretty prominent, although FSA is gaining a little bit of steam, but the HRA tends to be a little bit more prominent and start to build, especially as you have the high deductible plans. Where maybe the employer doesn't fund the entire amount of that deductible, and they allow for this rollover to accumulate year after year. So it actually starts to make up that extra part that's out of pocket typically. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So there are IRS maximums for dollar amounts and dates, but the employer ultimately gets to pick the amounts and dates up to the maximum. Is that right?
So as far as the dollar amount on the FSA, there is an IRS maximum, but the employer can dictate less than the maximum.
Got it.
On the HRA, there is not an IRS maximum. The employer still can put one on there. The date-wise for a carryover, that is something that actually starts to play into what I'll talk about next, which is the runout timeframe. So the runout timeframe, and then again, we'll circle back and kind of tie it all together. So the runout timeframe is the timeframe that you have to submit claims for the prior plan year before your carrier can no longer reimburse those claims. So, for example, most employers go by 90 days just because it's typical. So you might have a 90-day runout, which means, okay, in the case of a calendar year benefit and using 2021 and 2022 as a plan year, you would have until 3/31/2022 to submit claims with dates of service from 2021. That's your runout. That's the time frame you have. Now, the interesting piece is if you have a run out of 90 days and you have an FSA with a grace period of 75 days, what that basically means is you can use, again, last year's money up through 75 days into the new plan year for your FSA, if that's the amount they chose. And then you have 15 days to submit any leftover claims, if you will, from last year, because that's the runout time frame. It's that extra 15 days. For an HRA, you have 90 days to submit claims from last year, so they don't get right. So they
I'm getting sweaty.
Right?
Like we don't have enough to pay attention to on our calendars, right?
It's a challenging thing that unfortunately it's because most people don't even know to ask that question. Right. They wonder why. Like the number one driver for phone calls and any really in across the board from a reimbursement call center is how come I got this letter that says you're not going to pay something, or how come I got this letter that says I have to pay back something? And it's because no one would have any idea to ask these questions. So that's part of the reason why we're doing this is to try to give a little bit of an upfront, education. So kind of taking a step back towards the runout. Now the runout can be determined by the employer to be any time frame. It could be 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. We've had employers do 180 days. Just depends on how long they want their accounts to be open, so to speak, because you have to reconcile at some point, and allows the person to send in claims from the prior plan year. The interesting caveat to all of this, or so to speak, is if someone has an HSA doesn't use any of this really, because when it comes down to it, an HSA, you can actually submit claims from the day one when you enter the HSA. So if you are in a plan that is what they considered HSA qualified, and that means it hits a certain deductible amount for medical and pharmacy, and that's something you would, as an employer, you would know, or as an employee, you would ask your employer, because typically they would ask you about it, or they would offer it to you rather. And you would be able to actually enter a claim 3 years from now. So if you picked up today and in 2024, you decided to submit a claim from 2022, you could do that legally, not a problem at all. Rollover, there's not really such thing because it just carries with you everywhere that you go. Plan year to plan year, it's not really a big thing. And you really never would receive any sort of a substantiation letter or anything like that because it's self-report. That's something that if you decide to use your HSA for something that is not qualified, you report that on your taxes in the year, and you ultimately just pay tax money on that, a certain amount. So the HSA, it kind of falls outside of these reimbursement accounts as it relates to these particular terms. So it's kind of take a step back to make it as simple as we can make it. Your grace period, it's FSA only, and it's up to 75 days. Again, that allows you to submit claims for last year's money into the current plan year, if you will, up to that 75 days potentially. Carryover, rollover, both FSA and HRA, and it basically takes any unused money once the run out is over to move into the new plan year, so you can use it for all your new plan year expenses. And then, as we mentioned, your run out, that's the time frame that you have to submit your claims for the last plan year, and that again is determined by your employer. But like probably most people, no one's going to read through a 72-page document, and some people don't even understand the verbiage. So why would they specifically look for run out or carryover? And it's kind of sometimes outlined with different words. But I can tell you that most people, like I said, are calling us the first week, second week of January, totally confused. So I think the best way to get it out there is to have people do, some sort of a podcast or have some sort of a teachable session that would help. And I really wish, and I hope this prompts employer groups or even employees to sort of handle this a little bit different in the future, because just like anything else, nobody really wants to take angry phone calls. Nobody wants to have to send out letters. You guys don't, this employees or employers or clients, you don't want to have to call us. We don't want you to call us and feel upset. We want to make sure that we make this a true benefit and educate you to the degree that we can.
See, everybody can have a pocket-sized Jerame if they just listen to this podcast.
I'm actually, if you know me, I am just about pocket sized. So
we should have named the podcast Pocket Sized Jerame.
That's it.
It can be an offshoot for all the reimbursement products, because I think it is truly the land of confusion around all of these things. So thank you so much for clarifying. That was incredibly helpful. And I hope our listeners find that just as useful.
Yeah, we're going to be singing Phil Collins the rest of the day.
Sorry. We tend to do that. See, we talk about playlists a lot on the show. I think Teresa, the one episode, the dirt on healthcare proxy, and then we started talking about those types of songs, and maybe we can come up with a Land of Confusion playlist for reimbursement products.
Reimbursement, that would be fair. Nobody likes my playlist, so I'll just keep that to myself. But, I think Land of Confusion, whether it's the Disturbed version, which is my preference, or the Phil Collins version, that's mine too.
And Disturbed, I mean, that kind of fits right in with all of this.
That's what I'm saying.
Fits in with reimbursement for sure. I think we need to expand the podcast playlist.
Yes. Thank you for joining us again, Jerame. And who knows, we may invite you back to further explore the Land of Confusion.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by Nova Healthcare Administrators. Why did they let us do this? Because at the end of every day, every Nova associate is driven to do what is right. We want what's best for our clients and their members, and we do a great job sharing what we learn with each other. Between our colleagues and business partners, we know a lot of kind, smart, and thoughtful people who we convinced to share their tips with you.
And don't forget to leave us a review, give us a like or subscribe, but most importantly, please share. We'll find the insiders and you share it with the outsiders. And if you have a topic you'd like us to address, you can find us on Twitter at UNDRTheCoverage or send an email to podcast@novahealthcare.com.